friends. I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of social division. In this season, we're talking about how we can respond to the brokenness in our own lives and in our society with our heads, hearts, and hands. And you can check out my ebook, Head, Heart, Hands, if you want a better framework for these conversations. Today, we get to jump into a conversation about white evangelicalism. And that brings up questions of political and racial divisions, and those are particularly pertinent given our historical moment. My guest is history professor Kristin Du Mez, and I'll introduce you to her in a second. But just as a brief introduction, she has really helped me, and her recent book, Jesus and John Wayne, has helped me to understand the cultural forces of evangelicalism and how those forces have played into recent political events. I am someone who grew up as a Christian, and as a Christian within evangelicalism. So I got to be honest that this was a somewhat scary conversation for me to have, and it was a somewhat hard book for me to read. But I'm really grateful because I feel like I now have a better understanding of the history and the social forces that have contributed to many of our current national divisions. I do believe that understanding how those divisions arose will help me, will help us participate in healing those same divisions. So in today's episode, we get to talk about the events at the Capitol on January 6th. We talk about everyone from John Wayne to Phyllis Schlafly to Donald Trump, and we talk about what it might look like to move forward in love. Well, my guest today is Kristin Du Mez. She's a professor of history at Calvin College and the author of a book that came out last June but is already in its third printing for reasons that I think are going to become clear. It's called Jesus and John Wayne, How Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Kristin, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right. So I've been hearing about your book for a couple of months now by friends who grew up in and around evangelicalism in America. And then it came up again, especially after the events on January 6th with the insurrection that happened at the U.S. Capitol. And knowing that that event had a lot of people who described themselves as evangelicals who either participated or who were present for the march on the Capitol, even if they weren't actually inside the building or storming the Capitol. And so it just brought my attention back to your book, and I'm really glad that I then took the time to read it and get a chance to talk to you today. And I have a lot of questions for you, but I wanted to start off just like framing our conversation because I know we don't have hours to talk. And I'd like to do, kind of a roundup of the history of evangelicalism in America, in 5 minutes or less. I mean, maybe not quite that, but, do some sort of big picture historical overview. And then obviously try to understand the implications of all of that for our present moment, and especially as we start to reflect on the Trump presidency and all it represents. But then I'd like to conclude by talking about what it might look like to heal from some of the divisions that we are really facing right now. But I thought before we got into all of that, I'd love to hear just a little bit about you personally, if you'd be willing to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your own faith tradition and how writing this book relates to who you are and where you come from.
Sure. So I grew up in Sioux Center, Iowa, a very small town in Northwest Iowa in a conservative Christian community. A lot of people ask, are you evangelical? Were you evangelical? And it all depends on definitions. I grew up in an ethnic subculture, so Dutch Reformed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a member of the Christian Reformed Church. My mom was a Dutch immigrant. And so I always kind of had one foot in, one foot out. I never identified as an evangelical. People in my tradition tended to identify over against evangelicals. But looking back, I can also see that I was deeply influenced by evangelicalism through the popular culture. So I grew up listening only to Christian contemporary music. We had one bookstore in my town and it was a Christian bookstore, right? And so, we listened to James Dobson on the radio in my home. And so I think that really influenced the approach that I took to the history of evangelicalism, understanding that evangelicalism is not purely a set of theological beliefs. It's not based even on church attendance, where you go to church. I came to see it as how deeply you are immersed in the evangelical subculture, in this evangelical consumer culture, how much your religious, cultural, and political values are shaped by this broader culture.
So, and at some point you decided, and I'm going to actually do the research to link all those things together, going back really about 100 years.
Yeah. Yeah. So the book itself, the idea for this research goes back a long time, more than 15 years. And I wasn't primarily interested in writing a history of evangelicalism, but my attention was drawn to ideas of evangelical masculinity. And so this was back in around 2005, 2006. And I had been lecturing at Calvin in a class on U.S. history on Teddy Roosevelt. And I was showing my students how masculinity worked in history, how it could be linked to American power, to empire, to religion, to economic shifts, and all sorts of things. And after that class, a couple of male students came up to me and said, "Professor Du Mez, there's this book you have to read." And it was John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. And I listened to them, I opened it, and the book opens with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt and goes on to sketch a very militaristic conception of Christian manhood. Right. This was the time of the Iraq War. And we were seeing all this survey data about how evangelicals embraced the war, preemptive war in general, condoned the use of torture. And so I just started to ask, as a historian trained in gender, what might one have to do with the other? And so that was a long time ago. And I ended up setting the project aside for various reasons. And I picked it up again in the fall of 2016. And it was at that point when I picked the research up again that I realized I was really backing into these broader questions of what is evangelicalism? How does evangelicalism work? How is authority structured? And what does this look like really at the popular level? So this is a history of evangelical popular culture and really kind of the consumer side of things. What does it look like for ordinary people?
Well, and that kind of brings us to your title. And I'll say, when I first heard this title, Jesus and John Wayne, I was confused because I didn't actually understand with some implicit or automatic response why those two figures would be held together in a book about American evangelicalism. And honestly, I was a little skeptical. I was like, okay, what shortcut is she taking? And why? I mean, I don't buy it. So first of all, I'm going to apologize for the skepticism because you did convince me. And I do think it's a bit of a shortcut, but a helpful one, like a way to actually frame in a very short way what you're talking about when it comes to both the masculinity and the militantism and of evangelicalism as it has developed in the United States. So I'm wondering if you can do a little bit of a history lesson for us, maybe using John Wayne as a touch point over the course of, what did you learn about Jesus and John Wayne specifically as you looked at this history?
Yeah, so I did not set out to write a book about John Wayne, not at all. I was surprised as you are. So, and it is a bit of a short title, has to do a lot of things. And this is also a trade book. So I've always considered this my book about white evangelical masculinity and militarism. Mm-hmm. But early on in the titling process, the publisher made clear that as a trade book, we were not allowed to use the words masculinity or militarism in the title because they were too long. So you can see the dilemma. So we ended up having to get a little creative. I had already kind of landed on Jesus and John Wayne. And the way that happened is, when I looked at John Eldredge's book, and then I looked at all the other literature on evangelical masculinity that was just bubbling up at the time, right? Eldredge's book sold more than 4 million copies. So it really spawned this cottage industry. And I was really startled because, I had kind of taken evangelicals at their word. They tend to define themselves as Bible-believing Christians. Mm-hmm. And these books didn't have a lot of Bible verses in them. And the ones that they had were really kind of ripped out of context. And instead, they looked to Hollywood heroes for models of quote unquote Christian masculinity. So, Eldredge didn't cite John Wayne, but he loved Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart. Yeah. And random soldiers and cowboys and just mythical heroes, warriors. And so many of these other books did the same. And the closer I looked, the more I saw John Wayne just popping up in very unexpected places as the icon of American masculinity and Christian masculinity. And so I became really curious about that. And I traced back through history and came to see how in the post-World War II era, as evangelicals were really consolidating their power, uniting in the National Association of Evangelicals, and they were kind of coalescing around a set of issues. Christian nationalism was the Cold War context, gender traditionalism, so the stark difference between men and women, and for men that looked like being masculine protectors, and for women it meant being vulnerable and submissive. And race was a part of this too. This was always a kind of white patriarchy. And I saw these issues come together in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And it was at that time that John Wayne was also at the height of his popularity. And he came to stand for this kind of quote unquote traditional American masculinity. Much the tradition of Teddy Roosevelt himself. So John Wayne was a cowboy hero. That's his early stardom, and then he starred in World War II movies where he was fighting the good war, and fighting against the Japanese, and then he starred in the Green Berets where he brought that heroic American manhood to the battlefields of Vietnam, and he really did come to symbolize for American conservatives this kind of retrograde masculinity, this throwback masculinity that came to be a symbol of conservatism and increasingly a symbol of white evangelical masculinity as well. And so what I end up doing is just kind of tracing this history through the decades from the 1940s up to the present. And we can see consistent patterns where men like John Wayne, men like Donald Trump, to jump ahead in time, and many in between, ended up kind of serving as models of this quote unquote Christian masculinity, this warrior masculinity, this protector for Christians, precisely because they had not been formed by traditional Christian virtue. They were unrestrained by certain biblical pronouncements like love your enemy or the fruit of the Spirit. And for that reason, they were able to fight for Christianity, to defend, to protect the interests of American evangelicals.
Yeah, I remember even thinking once I was convinced that John Wayne was the right symbol for what you were talking about, then being so struck as you did quote multiple different sources of these popular Christian books in which there was a direct reference to John Wayne specifically, not just someone who might be like John Wayne, but actually John Wayne. And then there's a photograph in the book of John Wayne's daughter with President Trump. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah.
So again, I was like, oh yeah, she did a good job. She got me. So thank you for that. I do want to also, before we move on, stop and define our terms a little bit, because I have, been to seminary and I've taken church history classes. And I think that sometimes a kind of theological definition of evangelicalism is different from what you're talking about, which is a more sociological definition of evangelicalism. Yes. And then there's also this idea of fundamentalism, which again, in like a church history class, those were differentiated for me. And I felt like you put them back together in this book for reasons you spell out. But I'm wondering, before we continue, can you explain what you're talking about with the word evangelicalism?
Yeah, so I'm really kind of pushing back in this book against other scholars and many evangelical leaders themselves who insist on a theological definition. So the theological definition usually goes something along the lines of the Bebington quadrilateral, as history nerds tend to call it. So this is kind of an approach sketched out by historian David Bebington long ago, a British historian. And so we're talking about the authority of the Bible is central. to understanding evangelicalism, emphasis on conversionism, born again, crucicentrism, meaning the centrality of the cross and Christ's atonement, and then evangelism and activism. So acting out on these beliefs. So that's the kind of technical definition. I fully intended to use that when I started this book. That's kind of what historians do. You say, here's the definition, and then you go write your book.
Yeah.
But what I came to see is that through personal observation and through my sources, that theology traditionally defined did not seem to be at the core of evangelical identity. In fact, survey data suggests that evangelicals tend to have high levels of theological illiteracy. Many hold views that have traditionally been defined as heresy. And so if that's the case, I wanted to think about why do people self-identify as evangelicals? What does that mean? And I also came to see that if you use a kind of theological rubric, you end up really having a really large bucket that you're putting people into. So the majority of Black Protestants, for example, would check off those boxes. So are they evangelicals? I mean, you can argue such if you use that definition. The majority of global Christians are as well, global Protestants. So, which is fine if you want to define it that way, and you can ask some interesting questions. But when I looked at history, when I looked at kind of lived experience, when I looked at who was actually in community with whom, that's when it didn't make so much sense to pile Black Protestants who largely attended separate churches, participated in a separate tradition, and had vastly different understandings of activism, of political, the political outgrowth of their theological beliefs. It didn't make sense to lump them together in terms of describing a phenomenon that I wanted to describe. And so that's why actually the subtitle of my book is How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, because I'm talking specifically about white evangelicalism. And that's a really important distinction. As a historical movement and in terms of cultural identity, white evangelicals, I think, need to be examined, not completely separate from other quote unquote evangelicals, but as a fairly distinct movement. And so that's one of the things in terms of defining evangelicalism. So then how do I define it? I just said how I don't define it according to a theological rubric. I think of it as a series of networks and alliances, and as a consumer culture. So who is evangelical? I came up with a list early on. You might be evangelical if you grew up listening to James Dobson's Focus on the Family. You grew up watching Veggie Tales. You listen to Christian contemporary music. There's a whole list of, did you participate in this culture? Were you formed by these values? Maybe you attended a mega church. Did you grow up reading John Piper? Those sorts of things. And I came to kind of map out evangelicalism as a network. And so I actually had 3 amazing research students who helped me with this. And we had big sheets of butcher paper in my office and tons of sticky notes identifying, John Piper, Desiring God, Counsel on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, the Gospel Coalition, the SBC, Lifeway, Christian Publishing, like all of these things, and then lines and individuals and lines connecting them and just mapping out. And to me, that really is evangelicalism. It's relationships, it's distribution networks. And then we can start to look at what are the ideas that flow along these lines? What are the ideas that will lead to your inclusion in these networks? And what are the ideas that will lead to you being defined out of the fold? And that's really the way that I understand evangelicalism as a cultural historian.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really helpful. And I'm finding it so interesting that with this book sitting in front of me, I did not include the word white in the subtitle, just when I was saying it earlier, because I think there is, even for me, having grown up with the word evangelicalism, and I remember learning that it comes from the Greek evangelion, which means bearer of good news or bringing the good news. And I have wanted to think about if I am an evangelical, it's because I want to bring good news and the goodness of the gospel. But there is, I think, this very deep and often dark truth about white evangelicalism that you are really getting at in this book that apparently I am even now trying to shy away from a little bit in recognizing the racial undertones of the movement among evangelicals. Again, you've talked about the masculinity aspects of things as well as the militarism. And you do a great job of tracing all of those different threads in your book. But for me, one of the most compelling ways to recognize that evangelicalism is not just a theological movement is exactly what you just said, that if we look at the theological beliefs of white evangelicals and Black Protestants, they line up more than other sets of groupings, right, that would be compared to one another in terms of theological beliefs. And yet they don't line up in terms of how they understand society and politics, and certainly in terms of who is actually worshiping with whom on a Sunday morning or sharing life together in a church or community context. So all that is to say, I just appreciate the distinction. And I think I have become convinced that to simply define evangelicalism in theological terms is not only false, like it's just not true to what is happening, but actually can be really unhelpful in addressing some of these problems and trying to figure out what it might mean to, rectify some of them. So thank you for that. All right. So there's so much more we could talk about in historical terms, but I want to jump over much of that interesting and important ground to talk about our, the past couple of years and Donald Trump in particular, excuse me. You begin the book with a speech that President Trump gave before he was the president at a small Christian college in Iowa. And then you end by returning to President Trump's election and the overwhelming support that he carried both in the primaries and then throughout his time as president and to this day among self-described white evangelicals. And so there are many people in the media, and that included people who would call themselves evangelical. I think you would distinguish them as evangelical elites. That phrase comes up a few times in the book. And many people in those segments of the Christian movement were really confused by the 80% of white evangelicals who are voting for President Trump because from their perspective, wait a second, this is a group of people who are known for family values. They're known for taking the Bible seriously. How can they overwhelmingly support a man who's been married 3 times and who speaks crassly about women and who speaks in racist terms about people trying to immigrate to this country? There's misogynistic language, there's militaristic language and practice. And many people, myself included, said, well, that's antithetical to Christian values and specifically to evangelical values. And so what do we do with that? And I think many people, and again, myself included, said, okay, well, this is just about the fact that white evangelicals are so pro-life. Like they just want to put pro-life Supreme Court justices on the bench, and it is just a deal breaker unless that's what's happening. But I think you say, yeah, that's not the whole story. And misogyny and militarism has been a really strong current within evangelicalism for decades that is mirrored in the way in which Donald Trump approached his campaign and then his presidency. So I'm wondering if you can just speak again. You've said a little bit about this, but connecting those dots specifically about the masculinity, but really the dominant male who is a militaristic voice and the racism aspect of that as well, as far as the history of evangelicalism and why white evangelicals supported Donald Trump really that I think your research would have suggested that was predictable, not surprising. Yeah. So I'd love for you to speak to that a bit.
Sure. So yes, many as white evangelical support for Trump became visible, and it started to manifest already in 2015, and I think that's important because yes, Trump embraced pro-life views, but so did every other Republican candidate during the primary season, and yet evangelicals were critical to elevating Trump above those other evangelicals, so that's part of it. And then the overwhelming refrain was, how could evangelicals betray their values or, clearly this was just transactional support. They were holding their noses. And Jesus in John Wayne really pushes back against all of those explanations. And it does by looking at this history and by interrogating what was actually meant and is actually meant by something like family values politics. And so let me step back a minute, because I said more than 15 years ago, I started researching evangelical masculinity and militarism. And then I set it aside, partly because what I was finding was so distressing. It was crass, it was misogynistic, it was deeply disturbing. And related to that, I couldn't tell, is this fringe or is this mainstream? Right? If I'm going to spend years of my life looking at this really depressing material, to what end? And then I had other projects going on. I had to finish a book. I had 3 children, and I kept meaning to come back to it. But it was in the weeks after the Access Hollywood tape released, when we saw evangelicals, a handful, slightly waver in their support. This was, in October 2016, and then right back, supporting him despite everything. And that's when it dawned on me, because in the ensuing decade, from when I set the project aside, I still kept track of some of these guys who are the proponents of this militant Christian masculinity. And one after another, I saw them become embroiled in scandal, abuse of power, and sexual abuse.
Right.
And so in the days after the Access Hollywood tape released, it dawned on me. I thought, we saw evangelicals continue to back Trump, and I thought, we have seen this before. We've seen this so many times before. Evangelicals finding reasons to support abusers of power, to support men who they thought would, protect the faith, protect Christianity, and at great cost to women, to children, and to their communities. And so that was the first thing that kind of connected this for me. And then I started paying attention to the rhetoric I was hearing from evangelicals to explain their support for Trump. There was a little bit of nose holding, not very much actually, either at the top or through his grassroots supporters. I heard a lot of talk about he's our strong man. He is our protector. He positioned himself as such. He's the man who God has appointed for this time, for this hour. He will fight for us. And when I heard that rhetoric, it did bring me back to this history that I had started to trace. A history that revealed to me that even something like family values evangelicalism, which sounds quite lovely, when I looked at it historically and saw how it was really pieced together, I came to see that really at the core of family values politics was white patriarchy, white patriarchal authority. The whiteness was often invisible unless you look to history, and it becomes very visible. And at the core is this assertion of white patriarchal power. And if that's what we place at the core of family values evangelicalism, then it suddenly becomes, not a puzzle and not a betrayal of evangelical values, but in many ways, kind of just the next step.
Yeah, almost even a fulfillment of it.
Yeah.
In light of all of that, I'm curious, you've done all this research, and in light of that, how do you understand what happened on January 6th?
It was not a huge surprise to me at all, in part because the rhetoric had just been so pervasive, really stretching back decades and certainly amping up over the last 4 years and then the previous months. Rhetoric in evangelical circles and conservative circles of needing to fight, needing to battle for what was right, just enormous distrust that was spreading. And I knew that many conservative evangelicals had been steeped in this cultural ideal of warriors, that God appointed men to fight for faith, family, and nation. And it doesn't take a lot always to slip from metaphorical battles to actual battles. I mean, we saw that again in the early 2000s with the Iraq War, that not every evangelical was off fighting the war, but the vast majority of evangelicals were strongly promoting the fighting of that war. And so there's always been a connection between kind of the rhetoric of warrior masculinity and actual battles that are being fought. And what we saw now is kind of bringing that home domestically, and President Trump certainly helped kind of turn the discourse in that direction. So, I think, as you said, most white evangelicals were not storming the Capitol on January 6th.
Right.
But what I'm always interested in are questions of sympathies and affinities. Did we see strong denouncements of that violence? We did, from evangelicals, predominantly evangelicals who had been denouncing the administration over the last 4 years in various moments. Among kind of ordinary evangelicals, among Trump's evangelical base, we actually saw very little discomfort with what was happening. And that was something that I took note of, and something that I found very concerning.
And where in the midst of all of this, and I'm not only speaking to January 6th, but I realize that we've talked a lot about this kind of hyper-masculine, and that's an important aspect of what we're talking about. But where do women fall in all of this? Because obviously they are, I don't know the demographics, if 50% of evangelicalism is women or if it's higher than that. But where do women fall, and why do they fall where they do in all of this?
Yeah, it's higher than 50%, more women than men in terms of evangelicalism. And women's support for Trump is slightly lower than men's support for Trump within evangelicalism, and within the larger population as well. That said, I think it is a mistake to consider that because masculinity is as a motivating factor in support for Trump, and a particular type of masculinity, that means that women are somehow off the hook, because women participate in patriarchy. Women prop up these ideals. And so I have a chapter in my book, early in my book, God's Gift to Man, where I look at evangelical femininity as it's emerging in the 1960s and 1970s with people like Elizabeth Elliot and Maribel Morgan. And then I look at Beverly LaHaye and, some of these really influential women, and how they develop kind of these complementary ideals of quote unquote biblical womanhood or evangelical femininity. So women are passive, women are submissive, women are ultra feminine, and need to support the men in their lives, need to defer to them, need to submit to them, and need to kind of build up their egos so that men can fulfill their God-given roles, which is to lead and to fight. And so I had that chapter, and it was remarkable to me too when I was reading the works of some of these women, particularly women like Phyllis Schlafly, who was a Catholic but kind of can be considered an honorary evangelical for these purposes, and Beverly LaHaye, who is genuinely an evangelical. How often their discussions of femininity, of sexuality, of women's roles were directly linked to the American nation, to Christian nationalism, and to supporting this masculine militarism and militancy, that they really do go hand in hand, from the most intimate details, so sexual relations, to the structure of society, and to making sure that you raise boys who are strong enough to become soldiers and fight to defend the nation. Like, it really is very closely intertwined. It's not just that femininity is this girl thing off to the side, this private matter. This is very closely linked to a broader political agenda. So I do that in the book. I will say, though, that the book is primarily about evangelical masculinity. And so evangelical femininity does take some really interesting twists and turns. It evolves alongside this masculinity. I kind of dropped that narrative because of time and space limitations, but I am excited to say that my next book will pick that up. So my next book is a book on the cultural history of white Christian womanhood, and it has a title, and it's called Live, Laugh, Love.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's great. Well, how exciting. We'll have to talk about that one once it comes out.
Yes.
Yeah, I think, and it is interesting for me because I'm someone who I think had one foot in evangelicalism for all of my life as a Christian, although I was raised in mainline Protestant churches, and because I went to secular and kind of highly intellectual schools, I had was not in the midst of that Christian culture. Like, I knew that it was weird that I listened to Christian music on the occasions that I did. And I knew about Wild at Heart because people were quoting it to me, but I didn't actually read it. Like, so it was funny reading your book because I'm like, I recognize so many of these. And like, I did go to a church where like James Dobson's little, advice for the week was one of the bulletin inserts, but my parents were not listening to him on the radio. So it was like this in and out thing. And I think I'm sure I'm not alone in that. And I'm sure I'm not alone in many people who grew up with any connection to the Christian subculture in America for the past, 20 to 50 years could pick up this book and say, oh yeah, I know those people. And there's a lot of Americans who've never heard of them. Like there was this celebrity status to somebody like John Eldredge. And yet, 4 million people read the book, and yet a whole swath of American culture who has never heard of the man. I'm curious, so we've talked a bit about the history. We've talked about how this has led in some not surprising to you, at least, ways to whether it's President Trump's election or even to January 6th. But I want to turn just for the end of our time to talk about how people can, I guess let's say this. The first thing is to name that all of this has amounted to a fair amount of social division and political division, like increasing polarization as opposed to bridge building, right, within our culture. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I am most concerned about is asking, what does it mean to identify the harm that is inherent within social division? And I think you've spoken to that, both the harm within the church itself, as we think about just this divorce that, in terms of segregated Sunday mornings, or even the more mainline and more liberal strands of Christianity and the more conservative. And, we can talk about divisions all day long within the church itself. But then there are the divisions and politicization and polarization of our nation more generally, and the ways in which evangelicals have participated or contributed to that. So I'm thinking about all those divisions and about what it might mean to actually respond to them with hope and with healing, to participate in that. And I think, honestly, as much as your book, in lots of ways, it pokes the bear, right? I mean, it's saying there's a big smelly thing over there and we've got to go pay attention to it. But I think that acknowledging harm is the first step towards healing. And I think that's what your book begins to do. So I would love to end by talking about healing, but I wanted to just read the final paragraph of your book because I think it points in that direction. So you write, although the evangelical cult of masculinity stretches back decades, its emergence was never inevitable. Over the years, it has been embraced, amplified, challenged, and resisted. Evangelical men themselves have promoted alternative models, elevating gentleness and self-control, a commitment to peace, and a divestment of power as expressions of authentic Christian manhood. Yet, understanding the catalyzing role militant Christian masculinity has played over the past half century is critical to understanding American evangelicalism today and the nation's fractured political landscape. Appreciating how this ideology developed over time is also essential for those who wish to dismantle it. What was once done might also be undone. I would love to hear you just think a little bit about that undoing and what that might look like, especially under this heading of evangelical, of good news, of bringing something new and life-giving and redemptive into the world. So, how do you think about undoing some of that harm?
Yeah, so the book itself, as you've kind of hinted from its subtitle, chapter titles to the tone of the book, is not a gentle book. It's been described by one reviewer as urgent and sharp-elbowed, and I think that gets it exactly right. Mm. And at the same time, or because of that, despite that, I don't know, it's been remarkably popular with evangelicals themselves, with conservative white evangelicals, which is not necessarily something that we anticipated when we released the book. And I've been so heartened by the responses of so many, the humility with which people are receiving this book. People who have absolutely lived and breathed this this cultural evangelicalism. I mean, the week it released, I started getting letters. I still get several a day from readers, most of whom are evangelicals or former evangelicals who say some version of this is the story of my life. And then they go out and sketch like how their own life has mapped onto this history. And at the same time, they say, and thank you for this, for finally giving me eyes to see, right? They participated in this, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, usually some combination of the two, and never fully understood. Like one man wrote, I bumped into so many of these trees, but I never saw the forest until now. And so I think that one of the things this book does is it helps people understand what they themselves have participated in, what they have been complicit in. And again, the humility with which people are receiving this has been really astonishing to me. And so, I mean, one of the things is simply just the power of history. And that's what that last sentence kind of points to. Once you see how things came to be. I mean, the first part of that is understanding that things didn't always look this way. There were times when conservative evangelicals thought masculinity looked quite different from this. There were times when conservative Protestants were not militaristic. There were conservative Protestants who were pacifists in the First World War. There were conservative Protestants who did not embrace, who actively rejected Christian nationalism, right? That you have all of these different narratives, and that's a starting place. And then we can start to see, well, how did we get to where we are now? And what we see is there were many choices, active choices that individuals made at different junctures, often for the purpose of enhancing their own power. And we can start to see how all of this came together. Then I think we are in a place where we are freer to ask, is this where we want to be? Is this how evangelicals, how Christians ought to engage our neighbors, ought to engage the other, however we define the other? What has this militancy, this militant posture of Christian manhood done not just to Christian men, but what has it done to Christianity? And one of the things that I saw, which gets at the corrupted of faith part of the subtitle, which is actually it's a theological claim, not a historical claim. I'm talking directly to Bible believing Christians through that, saying, okay, let's look at the Jesus of the Gospels. We see how this ideology transforms Jesus into a bloody sword-wielding warrior with tattoos down his leg, charging into battle, right? And so we see the explicit rejection of pretty clear biblical passages like turn the other cheek. No, thrown away, doesn't apply in this situation, right? We see this I think, distortion of biblical Christianity. And once we see how that came to be, I think it frees us to maybe or disconnect our own identity from this ideology, disconnect our own faith from all of this baggage, because for the longest time, these values had been packaged and sold as just plain Christianity. This is what Bible-believing Christians do. This is who we are. This is what we value, and this is how we act. And I think the history here helps us to see, no, there's a lot of cultural baggage here. And we can be faithful Christians, more faithful Christians, if we're able to identify that and address that. So I would say in terms of divisions, this book does shed a light on how evangelicals have increased the polarization through this militancy, through this us versus them mentality. I've also been fascinated to see how the reception of this book has been, I've seen the redrawing of lines. I've seen many conservative evangelicals, again, I would not have expected to embrace this book, embrace it and promote it. And I see the active rethinking of the boundaries that had long ago been drawn of who is inside Orthodox Christianity and who is outside, along divisions of race, of racism, gender, sexuality, that I think there's an openness now to thinking, what is the good news and what should that look like? and how much should it actually entail building walls and drawing stark divisions and excluding people from our communities. And so, I mean, it's too early to tell perhaps, but that's something that's been fascinating for me to watch play out.
Well, thank you for the contribution, because I believe it is, and I can tell just from what you've described about the response, there is a healing that happens even in acknowledging the wounds, right? I mean, and as with so many things, where if we are looking for power and control, that ends up causing a lot of harm, just socially, like for whoever is actually doing the power grabbing, but also for everyone who's around them. And we see that on these micro levels whenever another church scandal erupts. But we also see it in a family system, and we see it in a broader sense in our culture. But at the same time, I think about, I've been teaching a Bible study at my church about the healing stories in the Gospel of Luke. And just this past week, we were looking at Jesus healing on the Sabbath a man with a shriveled hand. And he insists that the man hold his hand out. Like there's this sense of make it visible. And then Jesus heals. And I just think about that in terms of making so much visible that honestly, even as a reader, there's a part of me that's like, oh, did you have to bring up Billy Graham? Did you have to bring up, I don't want to know that, right? Like there's some part of me that feels really protective of this history. And certainly you're not doing it in order to condemn all the people. It's just in order to say, guys, let's look at this, because if we don't understand how we got here, then we're just going to keep going in this direction. And I do believe there's like great hope for healing and restoration and change that is more true to bearing faithful witness to the gospel of Jesus, and not to the gospel of Jesus and John Wayne, and that I think is, at least that would be my desire, would be to bear witness to the gospel of Jesus, not to any other gospel. So thank you for the work that you've done to make that more possible.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, we're really glad to have had you here today. And I know you're heading into a busy semester as a teacher, and you've obviously got another book to write. So best of luck with all of that. And I hope we'll get to talk again. I don't know whenever that's coming out, but we will look forward to that.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate your own work too. And it's been a delight to get to talk with you today.
Thanks again for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. You can reference the show notes for a transcript of this conversation, and I would love for you to share, subscribe, rate, review this podcast so that more people can join our listening community. I always want to thank our co-host, Breaking Ground, my editor, Jake Hansen, my social media coordinator, Amber Beery. They all make this happen, and I'm really grateful to them. And I'm thankful for you, the listener. As you go into your day today, I hope you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.